If you're buying a house with a mortgage, odds are you're probably going to need an appraisal at some point. But what if you don't want one? There are a few ways to waive the appraisal requirement, but before I go into that, let's get some basics out of the way. If you don't know what an appraisal is, I already made a video about it. Check the link in the description below. Second, why would you want to waive the appraisal? Just because you can waive it doesn't mean you should. One factor is cost. If you're confident in the valuation and the property's condition, and you don't feel like you really need to have an appraisal, and you're eligible to waive the appraisal, then shoot, save the $700 to $1,000 fee. Next, if appraisers are really busy, they could create a bottleneck in the transaction because their turn times can slow down. We mostly saw this happen in 2020 and 2021 when rates were really low, but we could see it happen again when rates dip down in the future. This next one is a weird one. If the property is overpriced and everybody knows it, but the buyer is still okay with it, then the appraiser is not going to get in the way of that. Lastly, if the property isn't in the best condition and the buyer is okay with that, then the appraiser is not going to be there to call out defects that need to be fixed prior to closing, especially if the buyer is already aware of them and is willing to fix them after closing. So now that that's out of the way, how do you actually waive the appraisal? The judgment call ultimately comes from something called the Automated Underwriting System, or the AUS. This is a tool that only the lender can use to determine if the property and the borrower is eligible for an appraisal waiver. Unfortunately, there's no black and white determining factor. It's all just a risk assessment that the AUS is going to spit out either an approval or a denial. Therefore, this video is going to be going over how to have the chance to get an appraisal waiver. First, it needs to be a conventional loan. FHA, VA, USDA loan, government loans are always going to require an appraisal at time of purchase. Next, you need to put 20% down. While you don't need to put 20% down to buy a house in general, you can put as little as 3% down. In order to get an appraisal waiver, you have to put 20 down. I've heard of circumstances where you can put as little as 15 down, but I haven't run into that, so I'm going to stick with 20 for right now. 30 if you want to be safe. A lot of equity is really good for the chances of getting a waiver. Fun fact, your credit score, debt, and income actually don't play a role in this. It's all having to do with the property itself. Occupancy doesn't matter either, as long as you're not using it as an investment property and you're needing the rental income to qualify. So you can buy it as a primary residence or as a second home or vacation home, or even as an investment property if you can qualify without rental income to offset the mortgage payment. But if you need that rental income, which is determined in the appraisal, then you need to have the appraisal. So can you get an appraisal waiver on investment property? Sometimes. There's also some requirements for the property. For example, it has to be either a single family home or a condo. It cannot be a multifamily home or a manufactured home. Also, new construction is not eligible because this system relies on previous appraisals from the past. Also can't be a renovation loan. And you can't do it with a gift of equity either. A gift of equity is where one family member is selling to another family member and they're covering the buyer's down payment. This is the only time where the seller is able to pay for the buyer's down payment is if it's family to family. Sellers can always pay for closing costs up to a certain limit, but this is the only time that the seller can pay for the buyer's down payment. So since it's not an arm's length transaction, then an appraisal needs to be done to make sure there's no funny business going on. What can you do with this information? Well, if you're a listing agent and your listing is potentially eligible, it's a single family home and it's in good condition and it's a resale, not new construction, then if you receive an offer for somebody that's getting a conventional loan with 20% down and there's no, renovation aspect and there's no gift of equity or anything going on, then there's a chance that that offer could come with an appraisal waiver. The catch here is that we won't know if we have the appraisal waiver until after we're already under contract. The reason for this is because the AUS needs to be able to read the property address, and we can't put in the property address until after we're under contract. Otherwise, disclosures will be triggered and the file would have to be deleted if it's not properly disclosed. So that's about purchases. Well, what about refinances? If it's an FHA or a VA streamline refinance, you can possibly waive the appraisal, but you can't waive the appraisal. In other words, you have to have the appraisal if it's a cash out refinance. But if it's a conventional cash out refinance, you can still get the appraisal waiver as long as there's a lot more equity. We're talking about 35–40% equity instead of the standard 15 or 20%. If you thought this was helpful, make sure to hit that like button and drop me a subscribe or a follow or whatever that's called. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.